Hello and welcome to Scripture Untangled, a podcast by the Canadian Bible Society. My name is Joanna Lafleur. I'm a friend of the Canadian Bible Society, and I'm going to be your guide for today's episode. Today, we feature an interview with Arthur Guinness, and he's going to be interviewed by Lorna Dueck. Arthur Guinness is a prominent social critic, a senior fellow at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and a founder of the Trinity Forum. Dr. Arthur Guinness is the author or editor of over 30 books, and he's going to be discussing his newest book, Signals of Transcendence, with Lorna Dueck today. But Dr. Guinness has long had a backstory of wrestling out public faith. He has worked to reaffirm the religious liberty clauses of the American First Amendment. He has authored public school curriculum and inspired many in understanding faith in God. Dr. Guinness was born to missionary parents in China. He began his broadcast career in England with the BBC and then moved to the United States in 1984 and has been a scholar and educator ever since. Artist Makoto Fujimuro describes Arthur Guinness as a North Star to guide our imagination and give courage to our journey. He has certainly helped many navigate life through his lifelong passion to help people get a sense of their confusing world. Dr. Guinness lives with his wife Jenny in McLean, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. Now here's the conversation with Lorna Dueck.
Our guest today, Dr. Arthur Guinness, is going to challenge us to listen for the voice of God speaking into our lives. Dr. Arthur Guinness, who insists on being just called Oz, describes God's voice to us in the title of his newest book, Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life. And if you have had the privilege of listening to Oz narrate that book, as I did via Audible, you will hear each chapter conclude with his deep BBC-trained voice cautioning you, be ready for the call that comes to you. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Well, hello, Oz, and thank you for joining us. Where are we finding you located today?
Well, a pleasure to be with you, Lorna. Now, I'm in McLean, Virginia, not too far down the road from the CIA, about 20 minutes outside of the center of Washington.
Good. In your library, in your office?
In my study, yes.
Well, I'm glad you do study, because this new book, you've brought us so many classical authors. And in one chapter, you quote the poet W.H. Auden. Man produces evil like a bee produces honey. I am amazed at the evil you have survived, Oz, as a child witnessing the 1949 Chinese Revolution. Can you describe some of your childhood that you wrote about in this book?
Well, my first 10 years were pretty horrific. You know, when the Japanese invaded China in 1937, they killed 17 million in the invasion. I was born the year of Pearl Harbor in 41, and we lived in Kaifeng, the old capital of China, and we were surrounded by the Japanese army on one side, the Communist army on a second side, and the Nationalist army on a third side. And in 1943, my parents and my two brothers, we were caught in a terrible famine in which 5 million died in 3 months, sadly, including my brothers. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. I was too small to know much about it myself. When we joined the refugees on the road looking for food and water, there were 10 million. And so it was a hair-raising time, and my parents' descriptions afterwards, there was cannibalism, people selling their children for an evening meal, the horrors of that sort of situation. Then we moved to what was then Nanjing today. So I was there, and I do remember that part. I was there for the first 2 years of the Reign of Terror after the triumph of Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution.
Your parents were medical missionaries. That's right, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. But would you mind if we get another important fact out of the family story? You were all part of the beer family, the Guinness beer family. Can we just get the God and Guinness beer issue out of the way on your story? Because I'm sure so many people are fascinated at God's connection to your family's beer?
Well, I'm actually very proud and grateful for my family's heritage, both in the brewery and in terms of faith. Originally, the founder was Arthur Guinness. We call him in the family the first Arthur. Now, he came to faith through the preaching of John Wesley in Ireland. And one of Wesley's simple principles was earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So Arthur Guinness built into the family firm from the beginning a strong record of social care. So always paid higher than average for the workers, gave them social welfare and medicine and all sorts of things that only really two other corporations in the 18th century did, Rowntree and Cadbury's, the chocolate makers, who were both Quakers. So I'm very grateful for our families. There was a real caring for the city of Dublin and the poor, for housing and so on. So for a long time, our family were Ireland's greatest philanthropists, most generous, although they did much of it anonymously. So I come from the branch of the family that's kept the faith ever since.
Fascinating. And was beer created as a social project? Was the Guinness beer, was there a health issue that they were addressing with it?
Not really. That's a sort of an American myth they put out, that he had a vision. But it's certainly true that in the 18th century, the problem was not a drug craze, it was gin craze. So moderates, and certainly Christians, drank beer. So you had on the one hand the problems of gin, and the other hand the problems of dirty water before modern plumbing. And so beer was a good way of going. And so that certainly is true, but it wasn't the reason for the founding of the firm. They just did very well. And it appealed to those who wanted not to get drunk on gin.
Okay. Well, okay, if that all angle of the history of your life isn't fascinating enough, you married an amazing supermodel, Windsor Elliott. Mm-hmm. Anyone can Google that. And it is, we're going to get to her story also, which is chapter 7 of your new book, Windsor's Story. But you're 81 years old. And you've not stopped teaching. You have not stopped writing new ideas for us. Can you tell us how you stay energetic for the challenge of being a public educator?
Oh, Lorna, I'm not sure I have any great secrets. Although my own doctor is a good friend. He always says, always be planning 20 years ahead of your age. It's now impossible since I've reached 80. And also be talking to people at least 20 years younger than your age, which keeps you fresh. And certainly the fact of living here in Washington, engaging with university students all over the world, it keeps me fresher than I would if I retired to some backwater, but I'm not sure it's any great secret.
Okay. Well, I felt your new book, Signals of Transcendence, took me through some of that library that you're sitting in, where you summarized insights from great literature for us. And I'm so valuable. I think it's just such a great way for a new generation to read that literature. But before we get into those insights, let's talk about you and your reading of the greatest book, the Bible. What is that practice like for you?
Well, when I came to faith at the age of 18, and then later went to London University, I had wonderful mentors who introduced me very early on to the essential notion of daily private worship. I used to, in the old days, to be called a quiet time, the heart of which is reading at least a good chapter of the Word. So I've followed Jesus now for more than 60 years, and always, there have been a few days life has been too busy to do it, just impossible, but every day, I was reading this morning, and I just love that time every day in the Bible, in the Scriptures. And what's amazing is I've read it now, more than 60 times. You always, every year, see something fresh that you didn't see before. And I think, my goodness, why didn't I see that? And of course, the simple fact is that life is raising different questions all the time. And you bring those, at least in the back of your mind, to what you're reading, and you suddenly see again and again the incredible relevance of Scripture. I love it.
Well, I already mentioned how in each chapter of the new book, Signals of Transcendence, you challenge people to be ready for God's voice. So is being in the Bible connected to being ready for the call that comes to you?
Well, certainly, yes. But this book is written for seekers primarily and for searchers. Go back a bit, Lorna. You think of our world, Canada, the US, Europe, Britain. We're living in what my mentor, Peter Berger, calls a world without windows. You think of Plato's famous parable of the cave. We're like prisoners who are in a cave and only see the flickering shadows in the wall. And we take that for reality. So someone who escapes the cave and sees the sunshine, they're amazed. But if they want to come back into the cave, people will think they're mad and won't listen to them. And many will prefer the shadows flickering on the wall to the reality of the sunshine. Now, that's our modern world, the secular world, a world without windows. People have lost a sense of anything beyond the five senses. So that's what I'm thinking about. The Western world is in crisis, and it needs a rediscovery of God and the supernatural. And so I hope my book will show how 10 stories of how people were triggered into the search for that.
And so how did you decide who and what should be included on such an important topic as listening for God?
The signals, some are very positive, heart-cracking goodness. Some are very negative, like you mentioned, W.H. Auden, the challenge of fighting evil. They're very varied, and I just tried to put in, the book's not too long because people aren't great book readers these days, but just 10 stories of people in different backgrounds who had different signals. Because a friend of mine took the story of Kenneth Clark towards the end of the book, who was in Florence, and in the sheer beauty of what he was seeing, felt the finger of God unmistakably, but brushed it off. And a friend of mine took that part of the story with a group of CEOs, 30 or so, and he said, how many of you have had similar experiences? All but two had. He thought maybe one or two might. All but two had. And the fact is, signals are far more common than people realize, although many people are embarrassed to follow them up, or they think people will think they're crazy if they do. So I'm encouraging people to listen to the signals as they come in our lives, because if they're true, life would be completely different. In other words, the signals do two things. They puncture what people believe up to the present moment. Not enough. And they point to something which, if true, would make all the difference. So they set out as seekers to see whether or not it is true.
So how might I recognize I'm experiencing a signal of transcendence, a signal of God?
Well, I think people are aware, having read some of the stories, they'll recognize they come in all sorts of ways, but they're unmistakable to the individual. In other words, it is something for the individual. As the Bible puts it, God has put eternity in our hearts. It's there. You can deny it, repress it, suppress it, stuff it down, hijack it into a different direction. But there are times when, without bringing faith in, without bringing God and the Bible in, life simply doesn't add up. The sums don't add up. And so people who stumble across something that makes them realize that, they know it. Now, you can't generalize and say, this is what a particular person will experience. It's different for everyone, but it happens to almost everyone.
And so then a transcendence signal is what sets your spiritual life in motion? Is that the point you're trying to get across to us?
No, it creates a seeker. So a time for questions is what constitutes a seeker. Now, a seeker, some of the stories in the book, the searchers find almost immediately. So W.H. Auden, extraordinary story of his, he said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute, and met Jesus almost instantly. The most famous story in the book is C.S. Lewis, a very hard-boiled atheist. And he became a seeker when he was, quote, surprised by joy. He couldn't explain as an atheist, but it was more than a dozen years before he became a discoverer. So people don't begin their spiritual lives with this. They begin the search.
And the signal, that spiritual call, is like a call, an invitation to our place with God.
That's right. But remember, it's only, as C.S. Lewis himself said, a signpost is not the destination. A signpost to home, when you get home, who cares about the signpost? But when you see the signpost and it puts you on the right track, it's all important. But it's only a signpost, and the signal is only a signal. What matters is to arrive, to get home. You remember the famous quotation of St. Augustine after his own search in his prayer, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." But for many, there is that search in between, but the signal triggers the search, and that's what gets people going.
So give us an example of one of your favorite collections of where that signal was triggered.
W.H. Auden is one I probably use more often and relates to more people because people have a passionate sense of justice and injustice today. Auden, the poet, as you remember, was an atheist and a radical left-winger in the 1930s and a gay at a time when it was unfashionable to be a homosexual. He fought on the Republican side against Franco in the Civil War. And when World War II loomed, he came over to the US in Manhattan. Now, of course, no television in those days. So apart from reading the newspapers, the only way of following what was happening was going to the cinema once a week to see the up-to-date documentary. And he lived in the Upper East Side, and unbeknownst to him, most people in that region were Germans. Now, to be fair to them, the war had broken out in Europe, but America was not involved. So the Germans were on the side of the Germans, as many others were on the side of the Brits, and so on. But he went to the cinema, and the documentary was on the siege of Poland. And Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children brutally. And the German audience, through the documentary, shouting out, egging them on, "Kill them, kill them." Auden was horrified. Sat there in the darkness and said, "First, I know we humans have evil in our hearts." But then he said, "I'm in trouble. To say that this, Hitler, Nazism, the stormtroopers, were absolutely wrong, and they had to be absolutely wrong. They obviously were absolutely wrong. You needed an absolute." And as an intellectual, there are no absolutes. That's for the old fogies. So he said, "I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute, which he needed to have, and found it in Jesus."
Just pausing this conversation to tell you about the Bible course. Because whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or you're just getting started on your journey, the Bible course offers a superb overview of the world's best-selling book. This 8-session course will help you grow in your understanding of the Bible. It uses a unique storyline, and the Bible course shows how key events, books, and characters all fit together. It's great for in-person groups or digital gatherings. It can really be used anywhere. You can watch the first session for free and review the accompanying course guide. Go to biblecourse.ca to learn more. biblecourse.ca. And as always, the link for this and anything else discussed will be down in the show notes.
All right. So the signal, and that's such a gripping story of Auden, and every chapter in your book contains a story like that of how a famous person encountered the signal of God. So the signal is a pointer, but not actually the truth itself, right? Help us how to understand how to discern that, the difference between the pointer and the difference between the truth it's pointing to.
Well, it punctures what people are satisfied in believing to this point and points to something which if true would make all the difference in the world. And so they become searchers. Now they've got to find. And, I have a companion book, The Great Quest, which very simply sets out how a thinking person thinks through the quest for meaning. But the search can be almost instantaneous, like W.H. Auden, or long, like C.S. Lewis. But there's a gap between the signal and the discovery.
And where might people go for the discoveries? Where are they being pulled to?
Well, stage one is that time for questions. Stage two, for the person who is now a searcher, stage two is a time for answers. In the old days, people looked to philosophy or art, and now it's commonly recognized they don't provide profound answers to life. You've got to eventually look at the great philosophies of life and the great religions, the great worldviews. And if you see that, there are only three broad families of faiths: the Eastern, Hinduism, Buddhism, the New Age movements, and everything goes back to an impersonal ground of being as the final answer. Or you have on the other side our secularist friends, atheists, materialists, agnostics. Everything comes from chance, what Richard Dawkins calls a stroke of dumb luck. Or you have the biblical answer, Jewish and Christian answer. Behind everything is a single personal force, a transcendent personal creator. Now, of course, depending on where you begin, you have profoundly different answers for almost every question you can ask. So the seeker goes, I need an answer. Which one is adequate? Which one is illuminating? And I think that leads towards the third of those that I mentioned. Step three is a time for evidences. All right, it's wonderful. It might give me answers. It might look adequate. It might be illuminating, but is it true? That's incredibly important in a postmodern age that denies that there is any truth. But even that isn't the whole way home. Stage four is a time for commitments. In other words, intellectually, someone may say, yes, this is incredible as an answer. I actually believe it's true, but I don't want to commit myself to it. No. The fourth stage is the one where it becomes real. And at that stage, people not only commit themselves as a whole person, mind, emotions, will, everything, they find that the Lord himself becomes real at that stage, maybe for the first time in the search. Although in some ways they realized the signal a lot earlier on was the voice of the Lord speaking to them with an intimation of eternity.
And you have a wonderful clarity about saying there's two key times we need that whole journey comes to us. One is the moment where we say, I'm unique from my family. And the second stage is when we realize we will die. Can you explain that a bit?
Well, Mark Twain used to say there are only two important moments in life: the day you were born and the day you discover why. Or put it another way, when we grow up, the psychologists say there are two important moments in our youth. One is when we're able to say, I am I. Overdevelop that and you have a narcissist. Underdevelop that and you have someone with separation anxiety who doesn't want to go out into the world and be themselves. But there's a second moment, and it often comes later, when people realize, I am I, and I won't be here forever. In other words, life is very short, and the day will come when we've gone, and then soon a day when no one will ever know that we've been here. What on earth does it all add up to? Now, for Tolstoy, enormously great writer, that death, the automatic annihilation of everything he was trying to do in his life, was the challenge that led him to start thinking and come to faith. He was famous as a novelist. He was wealthy as a huge plantation owner and had 14 children and a very happy, successful life. But he realized unless he faced the challenge of death, he didn't have the answer to what life meant.
You also declare that love contains some of the strongest signals of transcendence. So let's talk about chapter 7, at least in Audible, it's chapter 7. You write about your wife, but you never tell us she's your wife in that book. You write the story of supermodel Windsor Elliott, top of her career, and she leaves a very lucrative modeling career. Why?
Well, she was in the front cover of Vogue many times in the late 60s when the supermodels were just rising in that world. It was an incredible world. So she was in New York, and she was engaged to a young French baron who was a photographer, same age as she was. Later, he was the windsurf champion of the world, very handsome and so on. They would fly to Paris for the weekends with friends like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali. And her turning point, because she grew up in essentially an atheist family, although her mother was fascinated with an Eastern guru. But anyway, a world without any Christian faith. The world was her oyster. But one weekend, she was at a party in Salvador Dali's house, the surrealist painter. And the whole thing was surrealist. Drugs and all that. And here were these famous people. And in the middle of the party, Dali had his pet cheetah, a beautiful jungle animal, but tamed. And it was there with a diamond-studded collar and a wonderfully ornate, expensive lead and so on. And Windsor was looking at this, or my wife Jenny was looking at this incredible animal. And she was suddenly horrified that it was being reduced to being a caricature of whatever it was born to be. And then she looked at the crowd, people in their Nehru jackets with gold-studded collars too, and women with all sorts of things in their hair and incredible finery. She thought, my word, we too are caricatures of what we were designed to be. And it was as if a bottom fell out of the world, and she was staring into an abyss of meaninglessness. And she said to her fiancé, we have got to find if there's any meaning to life. She went back to New York. She didn't know any Christians, of course. Asked people at Vogue magazine what they sent her to the weirdest, wildest things, metaphysicians and so on. And it was a couple of years later, she'd gone nowhere. In fact, gone down, if anything. She walked up Park Avenue and she prayed. She said, God, if you're there, I can't find you. Will you please find me? And then gave up. Well, 6 months later the day, her mother, whom she couldn't stand, really, but was dying of cancer and had become a Christian. And Windsor thought, well, good faith to die by. Her mother had people into the apartment. And one day there was a young couple in there, and her mother, like mothers do, was showing Windsor's portfolio. And there was a photograph at which they all, not the couple, gasped. And Windsor said, oh, she said, I don't particularly like that photograph either, but why did you gasp? Well, they said, you may not believe this. 6 months ago, the very time Windsor prayed, we were going to a prayer meeting in Seattle. And we were getting coffee, and we went out of the supermarket, and the Holy Spirit said to us at the checkout, buy that magazine and pray for the girl on the cover. And they took it home, and they prayed it was the photograph of Windsor. And she realized that the hound of heaven was after her, and when she couldn't find him, he was not giving up on her. And that was a crucial step towards her conversion.
Oh, that's a remarkable story, which isn't quite in the book. So we got a great bonus that how the hound of heaven, as you call it, found Windsor. How did you find Windsor? Here she was engaged to somebody else, living in New York.
Mercifully for me, when she did become a Christian, which is a further story, she broke off the modeling world and actually broke her engagement too, and came down to Washington, where people introduced her to quite a number of Christians. And she had so many questions about her new faith. And then an article on her faith brought in hundreds of letters all over the world, no emails in those days, from prisoners, people proposing to her and so on. And she realized she didn't have answers to their questions. And someone sent her to the L'Abri community, the study center in Switzerland, where Francis Schaeffer was. Well, I happened to be working there. I'll just tell you, Lord, a very key moment of that. She went back to John Kennedy Airport to fly to Geneva and heard her name called in the concourse. Turned around, it was her former fiancé. And she wondered if she made a bad mistake, not coming to faith, but breaking it off. He said, come on, let's talk. He said, why don't you come to Paris with me? And she said, look, I don't want to be spoiled. People are giving up their place so that I can have a place. That would be the old me just to quit. Why don't you come to Geneva and to L'Abri with me? And he said, I'd love to, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'm having delivery of my new Rolls Royce. And as if the Lord said to her, Windsor, that's what your life would be like if you went that way. And she knew that was the end. Well, the two planes took off like an old B movie in two different directions, one to Geneva, one to Paris. And we met the next day.
Oh, that's such a beautiful story. For our younger listeners, L'Abri was a destination for people to meet Jesus Christ. It was just one of those special teaching places. And sometimes we really need to do that in our life. Like Jenny did, you have to get out of your current setting and just clear your head and listen for God. There's something about geography being required sometimes, isn't there?
That's right. And L'Abri was in a staggeringly beautiful place. So it was a wonderful place to think and wrestle and work out where you are in life.
And find a wife in your case. Lovely story. So how do I not miss the call of God?
Well, you have to have your ears open. Now, you obviously do, Lorna, and I obviously have too. And that call means everything to me. And by far, my best-selling book of more than 30 is The Call, Finding and Fulfilling the Purpose of Your Life, because there's nothing more purposeful than following the call of the one who knows us. So it's calling for the Christian. I mean, you take the notion of calling. In the East, Hinduism, forget it. Freedom is freedom from being an individual, not freedom to be yourself. If you look at, say, Richard Dawkins and atheism, what is purpose? Do it yourself. I remember as a student having Bertrand Russell, and he used to talk of the picture of the Greek giant Atlas who carries the whole world on his shoulders. That's the secularist way. You've got to do it yourself, all up to you alone. Now, you look at the Jewish and Christian way. When God calls us, it's not only be who you are, it's become whom you can become as your Creator knows you. With your character, your aspirations, your dreams, your destiny, only He can call out of us what we're born to be. And I love that. There's nothing deeper and richer than a Christian view of calling. And signals is just one way of waking up people who are thinking of anything else but God to the reality of God.
And how do I not miss it? How do I not miss it?
All of us, those of us who know Christ, we should say daily, as it were, Lord, here I am. What do you want to say to me today? But of course, I'm sure some of your listeners are people in Canada who are just atheists or whatever, drifting through life, heading through life. There's so much more. And they should at least say, God, if there is a God, rather like Jenny did, Windsor did, I can't find you, but I'm open to your finding me. Speak to me if you're there.
And you want this search to really, I think what I concluded from the book is that you believe the whole nation, the world, is past due for an awakening. Why?
Absolutely. It's a bigger question, Lorna. We can get into another day. To put it simply, the moment is called a civilizational moment. If you think every great civilization in history is either in history books or in ruins or in museums. Why? They rose and fell. There comes a moment in a civilization when they lose touch with their inspiration or their dynamism. Now, the Western world, its inspiration is the Jewish and Christian faiths. At a civilizational moment, there are only three broad options. One, renew the inspiration. Two, replace it with something deeply adequate. Or three, decline. The West is there today. Many in the West have rejected Christian faith. The alternatives, above all Enlightenment secularism, have proved totally unsatisfying, and the West is visibly in decline.
I would add materialism and technology are part of the things we've replaced for transcendence.
That's right. And they're quite simply inadequate. We have lots to live with, but not much to live for.
Okay. Can you conclude us today with how you conclude each chapter in the book? Each chapter, you talk about our ears. Let those who have ears to hear.
Let him hear.
Yeah.
Which is obviously the words of our Lord. And he clearly understood that while we all have ears physically, a lot of people don't have hearts and minds that are open, curious, searching, inquisitive. In other words, they're much more closed. And Max Weber called it people are tone deaf. They don't pick it up. So we've got to be open.
All right. Yes, the phrase is to be ready for the call that comes to you. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Os Guinness, thank you so much for writing one more book in your great library. And I encourage our listeners to read that, to listen to it on Audible as I did. And thank you very much for being with us. And do bring our greetings to Jenny as well.
I will. Thank you, Lorna. Great privilege for me. Thank you. God bless.